this was very new, freshly made wine that was bottled very shortly after harvest and after fermentation and shipped out to all kinds of distribution points. And Beaujolais Nouveau, the world fell in love with it. This was a time when we didn't have New World wines to fit that kind of fruit-driven, easy drinking, affordable slot in the supermarkets. And that was largely filled by Beaujolais Nouveau.
Hello and welcome to Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Hough, and I'm delighted that you're joining us as we get between the vines with some of the best wine writing out there. So sit back, pour yourself a glass, and enjoy the show with the Italian Wine Podcast.
This month, our guest is Natasha Hughes, Master of Wine and author of The Wines of Beaujolais, published by the Académie de Vin Library on the 22nd of September 2025. Hi, Natasha. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
Thanks for coming on. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I love an underdog story. I love a glass of Beaujolais. It's one of my favourite wine regions, so I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
You know, it's really interesting. Every time I talk to wine professionals about this book, most people, sometimes on the quiet, say, do you know what? I love Beaujolais. It's one of the wines that I drink most frequently at home, and yet it still has this image of being this kind of cheap, very one-dimensional wine. And I guess we'll talk about why that might be a bit later in this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's almost like a guilty pleasure. In a similar way, I think that Lambrusco outside of Italy certainly still has that reputation.
Absolutely.
Within Italy, Lambrusco is one of the great Italian wines.
I love
but it's still
Lambrusco.
Tarnished by that reputation from the mid-1980s.
Yep, absolutely.
And I think Beaujolais has much the same. I seem to remember an Only Fools and Horses episode where Del Boy was drinking Beaujolais at a dodgy wine bar. But that's another story.
Yep.
So let's go back to your beginnings, if you like, your origins in wine. When did your interest in wine begin?
So I came from a family background where, I grew up in London. My dad was a doctor. And like many kind of professional men of his generation, he drank wine. And both my parents were interested in food, but I didn't really get interested in wine in any kind of big way until much later. I ran a catering company part-time when I was at university.
Wow. When
some of my fellow students were tending bar to make their pocket money. I was off there sort of catering dinner parties and parties. And I then went to live in Australia, and people are much more comfortable around wine in Australia, maybe because they're surrounded by it and it's not a thing for posh people as it was for people of my generation. But I came back to the UK in the mid-90s and began working as an editor, copy editor, initially on books and then on magazines. And I got offered some freelance work on a magazine called Decanter. And I liked them and they liked me, and I kind of stayed and they gave me a job. So that's really how I got professionally involved in the world of wine.
Interesting. So your professional interest, in a way, preceded your personal interest?
Well, it kind of came from a flavour perspective. I was interested in flavour, I was interested in food, and then I found myself being given an entree into the professional world of wine and realised that there were a lot of things that there were a lot of similarities between the world of food and the world of wine in terms of flavour, but also wine is such a many-layered thing that it gave me an opportunity to indulge the scientific side of my interests as well as the more kind of humanities side of my interests. I enjoy history. I enjoy geography, but I also enjoy chemistry and biology, and wine was a way of uniting all of that, as well as indulging my love of flavour and my love of travelling.
Yeah, that's interesting, and you're certainly not the first wine writer who's expressed that kind of journey, if you like, that coming together of history,
Mm-hmm.
geography, science, travel. Wine really is, in some ways, the perfect vehicle to bring together all those interests in one bottle or glass. So you began writing with or working with decanter. You then decided to embark on the Master of Wine program. That was later.
Yeah, that was a few years later. I loved my time at Decanter initially as a freelance, and then I worked as the deputy editor on the website. And then about a year into my job, I lost my job because it was really the start of websites, and they hadn't worked out how to make money from
Mm,
websites. So unfortunately, I lost my job, but decided to carry on freelancing. And that must have been, gosh, at the tail end of 2001. So I really kind of started to hit my stride as a freelancer in 2002, 2003, and there were a lot of magazines at the time. And by 2008, with the economy crashing all around us and increasing concerns about the health aspects of drinking, which led to that all sort of led to a reduction in the advertising income that publications focused on wine were
mm,
receiving. So it became more and more difficult to make a living as a freelance writer. And I had a friend who was a master of wine who kept saying, "You really should do the master of wine, you know." And I kept saying, "No, it's scary. It's too big. I don't think I'm up to it." And she kept saying, no, you should do it. And finally, I decided in 2008 that if I wanted to stay working in wine, I really needed to make people aware that not only was I a writer, but I knew what I was talking about.
yeah.
And the Master of Wine program seemed like a way of proving my bona fides, if you like, despite the fact that I knew that it was going to be a bit of a challenge
Mhm.
achieving that. So I signed up as a student and got stuck into my studies. At a time, it was a really good time for me to do that because I was less busy on the work front. And I was very lucky in that my husband absolutely backed me to the hilt, both in terms of kind of emotional support and practical support.
Mm,
So I sat my exams for the first time in, I think it was 2010, and I passed my theory exams the first time round. And then in 2011, I passed my practical papers, and I then got stuck on my dissertation, which
mhm.
wasn't much fun, but I stuck with it. And in 2014, I graduated.
Fantastic. Extremely grueling process, I think,
It
as you
really is.
alluded to.
And I remember coming out from the feedback from a 12 wine blind tasting paper with a colleague of mine who turned around to me afterwards and said, I have never felt as good about myself and as bad about myself as I
Hmm.
have in the course of the past hour and a half. And it really, you really hit the highs and the lows.
Yeah.
When you get it right, you feel on top of the world.
Uh-huh.
And when you get it badly wrong, oh God, do you feel like an idiot or what?
But you excelled really in many ways in that process, winning 4 out of the 7 prizes awarded that year, including the Outstanding Achievement Award for the Best Overall Performance.
Oh, look, I mean, I put the fact that I won a number of awards down to the fact that I had a small graduating class. If there's 20 of you, it's very difficult to stand out from the crowd because there are so many incredibly talented, hardworking people.
Mm.
But there were only 6 in my graduating class, so the odds were in my favour.
Well, I'm sure it was entirely with merit as well, an outstanding achievement. What does it mean in practice? So you mentioned those years of economic uncertainty, I suppose, as a wine writer and being a freelance worker. What does the Master of Wine mean for you now in practice? What does it mean for your career?
Well, I still write,
Mm.
but I also do a lot of teaching, particularly MW students and also diploma students who are thinking of doing the MW. I've developed a course in tandem with a colleague of mine that we run under the heading of master classes,
Mm-hmm.
and effectively for both MW students and diploma students, we help them understand what the examiners are after and how to achieve a good how to demonstrate your knowledge articulately and
Yeah.
confidently on paper, because those aren't necessarily the skills that everybody has coming into the MW study program. So I do that, and I do a fair bit of consultancy and work with private clients. I have a much more diverse career than I did
Mm.
going into the MW. And I think, having those initials after my name gives me a credibility. It's like a seal of approval. People know that they can trust me to be, if not an expert in absolutely everything, because I don't think you can be an
Mm.
expert in absolutely everything, but I know a little bit about most aspects of the wine world, and I'm able to communicate my understanding pretty efficiently.
Absolutely. You're still writing, as you mentioned there, and I know you've been involved in a number of books published by the Academy de Vin Library, including on Burgundy, California,
Yes.
and Champagne, which brings us to the wines of Beaujolais.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first book, unless I'm much mistaken, that's been written specifically about that region in English, which is really remarkable.
Absolutely. So there are a few French books, but the most recent of those was
Mm.
written in the 1980s, and things have changed an awful lot since then. A colleague of mine, an American colleague called John Bonnet, wrote a book called The New French Wine that was published a couple of years ago, and that's got some excellent insights into the region. But Beaujolais itself hasn't really been explored with an English language book dedicated to the region ever.
Mm. And so, what inspired you to write that book? Did you pitch that to the Academy du Vin Library, or did they approach you?
Yes, I did. So I've had a long interest in Beaujolais. I
Mm.
was lucky enough to go to a French school for primary school, so I grew up speaking French. And when I started working in wine, a lot of my work was involved being sent to French regions that weren't the prestige regions of Burgundy and Bordeaux and Champagne,
Mm.
which all had their own dedicated experts. But I'd often end up going to different regions of France to go and research stories and for magazines. And I kind of fell in love with Beaujolais in the early 2000s, but at the time the region was on its uppers, not doing terribly well financially. The
Mm.
Beaujolais boom had faded and left the region with a bit of a hangover, the morning after a party.
Mm.
And the party's been great. And then you wake up the next morning and you look around and it's a complete disaster and everybody's feeling pretty poorly. And the region felt a bit like that at the time. More recently, I realized from talking to my colleagues and some tastings that I was beginning to go to that the region had kind of picked itself up, and actually there were some really good wines coming out of Beaujolais, but they weren't getting the recognition that I felt that perhaps they deserved. And also in an era when,
Mhm.
Beaujolais is, in theory, part of Greater
Yeah.
Burgundy, and Burgundy has become increasingly unaffordable for a lot of us. I know that the kind of Burgundy that I used to buy en primeur 10 or 12 years ago, I can no longer afford. And in Beaujolais, I found a region that could not only create wines that I felt had a lot in common with Burgundy stylistically, but where the quality was incredibly high and yet the wines remain affordable. So I thought it would be a good time to write a book about the region and what was going on there, and who the new leaders of the region are, as well as doing some profiles of the classics. And I pitched it to the wine library, and luckily they agreed that the time was right for a book about Beaujolais.
And in many ways, it's that cycle of boom and bust and then a revival again in more recent years that makes Beaujolais such a compelling region to study as a writer, I suppose. And you talk about this hangover, this region being on its uppers. What happened before that? I mean, you mentioned the party years, so just for our listeners who weren't around or don't really have a sense of what happened to Beaujolais, how it became this.
Well, let me go back a little further. So, if you look at the Victorian era and the early 20th century, Beaujolais, or at least bits of Beaujolais, were being taken seriously, and the Victorians loved creating classifications for things, and there were some vineyards. And there were some vineyards in Beaujolais that were rated as highly as some of the most famous vineyards of Burgundy. In the aftermath of the Second World War, phylloxera and the Second World War, Beaujolais shifted emphasis from producing high quality wines to largely being focused on producing big volume, cheap, affordable wines. And, to a certain extent, that had always been a strong tradition in the region, but it really began to dominate in the post-Second World War period. And one of the things that Beaujolais had long had was strong links with the nearby town of Lyon. Lyon is really not very far from Beaujolais as the crow flies. And the working men of Lyon had long drunk Beaujolais as their part of their everyday wine.
Yeah.
And, this was, you've got to remember, this was an era where people drank wine with lunch as well as with dinner. It wasn't terribly alcoholic wine. Quite often it was quite thin and weedy, but nevertheless, wine was very much part of an everyday drinking culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Beaujolais was also being sent to Paris by this stage, but quite often these wines were shipped in barrel rather than in bottle. And we know that if you've got a wine that isn't terribly high quality, by the end of a year, the stuff at the bottom of the barrel is not looking terribly healthy. So the bars, the working men bars and cheap restaurants where Beaujolais was served, when the new wine was actually shipped to them, started hanging out signs saying Le Beaujolais Nouveau est arrivé. The new Beaujolais has arrived. Come and get the good stuff. It's nice, it's fresh, it's fruity, it's not that tired old knackered stuff. So this whole idea of Beaujolais Nouveau began to be a big thing in these kind of working men's drinking dens. And there was a producer in Beaujolais called Georges Duboeuf. He was a négociant. So he bought wines from smaller growers and he bottled them in larger volumes and distributed them. And he saw this phenomenon of Beaujolais Nouveau and it triggered something in him. And he thought, well, actually, yes, these young, fresh wines are absolutely delicious. Why don't we make more of them? And he started bottling these wines as Beaujolais Nouveau and marketing them quite heavily. And Georges Duboeuf was a brilliant, brilliant marketeer. And this started in the 60s, and he created a real buzz about Beaujolais Nouveau. He started by having parties, and he'd invite celebrities and politicians and film stars and pop stars, and they'd all be photographed with bottles of Beaujolais Nouveau. And it began to be a thing, not just in France, although in France initially, but eventually internationally. People got the idea that this wine that was released on the third Thursday in November.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think that harvest probably happened late September, possibly even early October, this was very new, freshly made wine that was bottled very shortly after harvest and after fermentation and shipped out to all kinds of distribution points. And Beaujolais Nouveau, the world fell in love with it. This was a time when we didn't have New World wines to fit that kind of fruit-driven, easy drinking, affordable slot in the supermarkets. And that was largely filled by Beaujolais Nouveau. And for the 70s, 80s, 90s, Beaujolais was awash on a tide of Beaujolais Nouveau. It was the cash cow that carried the region, and the region milked it for all it was worth. There was so much money sloshing around the system that vineyards were incredibly expensive. Producers in Beaujolais had smarter kit in their wineries than producers in Burgundy. And unfortunately, what also happened was that the rush to bottle as much of this Beaujolais Nouveau as possible, as quickly as possible, ended up with a compromise in the quality of the wines being shipped out, which didn't do wonders for Beaujolais' image in the long run. And then New World wines arrived. Well, first of all, at least in the UK market, what we started seeing was Eastern European wines as the Soviet Union started to lose its grip. And then we got New World wines, and they filled that cheap, easy drinking slot. And Beaujolais, sadly, went from the boom times of the 90s, that by the time I started going to the region in the early 2000s, it was very difficult to sell Beaujolais Nouveau. And people who had, banked their future on the boom continuing forever, lost a lot of money. And consumers in most markets had fallen out of love with Beaujolais. Beaujolais had a bad rep, because the region had forgotten that along with Beaujolais Nouveau, there were actually some really, really nice top-end wines being made in the region as well. And they forgot to communicate about that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an incredible story and very well told, Natasha. I read that they were producing, at the peak of the boom in the late 1980s or early 1990s, there was more than 105 million bottles were being shipped around the world every year.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was just incredible. And in the UK, at least, the race to be the first to get your shipment of Beaujolais to your wine bar or restaurant just went to ridiculous extent.
Yeah.
I mean, people started getting the Red Devils to fly in their supplies of Beaujolais, or the paras would parachute into central London with bottles of Beaujolais tucked under their arm. It was just ridiculous.
Even today, it still has a kind of almost ironic cult following, leaving aside the fact maybe turned around the reputation and are now producing good quality wine. There's a festival, I think, every year still in in Wales. I think it's Cardiff maybe, and in various different places around the world. People still do celebrate, perhaps in an ironic or perhaps in a...
Well, so ironic. Japan is the biggest market for Beaujolais Nouveau. Biggest export market anyway for Beaujolais Nouveau. And actually, strangely enough, the Beaujolais producers tell me that it's very difficult to sell high-end wine from the region in Japan, because Japan still has this love of Beaujolais Nouveau, whereas perhaps in the UK for a time Beaujolais Nouveau began to be a bit of a kind of ironic thing. But there's this whole new wave of artisanal Beaujolais Nouveau being
Yeah,
produced, and actually the hip young crowds in the central London wine bars and restaurants actually have fallen in love with Beaujolais Nouveau all over again. But, it's not the thin, weedy
yeah,
stuff of
yeah.
yesteryear.
We'll come on to talk about some of those producers in a moment.
Mhm.
I wanted to share with you that I was in Beaujolais. I was in Lyon 2 years ago in November 2023, which was a fantastic time to be there because we spent the day in Beaujolais as well and visited some of the vineyards, and they were all just concluding their harvest. So it was a really fun, exciting time to be there. The wineries that we visited, it was a completely rustic, authentic, rough around the edges experience, but we were made to feel incredibly welcome. Family members were serving the wine. It was quite riotous, really. By the end of the evening, we were getting shipped around in a minibus, so it was a fantastic way to discover the region.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I know that we're going to talk about wine tourism maybe a bit later in
Mm,
this chat,
mm,
and I'll touch on
yeah,
some of the points you've raised there. But
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Let's come back to that. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, though, as well at this point was the variety, the grape variety used. So it's Gamay, isn't it? That is principal ingredient.
it is, so 95% of the region's production is red wines made from Gamay. About 3%, maybe 4% is white wines, and then there's a little bit of rosé as well, but made from Gamay, but not very much of the rosé gets out of the
Yeah,
region.
and then of course you have this famous declaration by Philip the Bold in 1395, where he
Mm-hmm.
cements Gamay's reputation perhaps as this lesser standing grape variety.
Yeah, so the prejudices against Gamay go back a very, very long time.
Mm,
But here's the thing. I mean, first of all, there are many, many reasons why Philip Lardy may not have been very keen on Gamay. And I go into them in the book, but just to sort of pull focus from that a little bit, you've got to realize that ampelography, the science of working out what kind of grape variety you actually have based on leaves and the shape of the bunches, etc., what they were calling Gamay back then may not be what we now recognize as Gamay for a number of reasons. One is that
right.
Gamay is a very, very ancient grape variety. It's the result of a cross between Pinot Noir and Gouais Blanc. Um, and the more ancient a grape variety is, the more clonal variation there is to the point where you get different versions of the grapes. So, for instance, if you think about Pinot Noir, actually Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc and Pinot Meunier are all closely related. And because it's an ancient grape family, they've all diverged genetically over time. So we don't know whether what we call Gamay now is what was planted in Burgundy back in the 14th century. Also, at the time, it was very, very rare that you would have a single grape variety planted in a vineyard.
Mm,
With the vineyards were planted with what we would now call field blends, lots of different varieties all at once. So it's very difficult to tell whether the grape variety that Philippe Lardy took against was actually what we would call Gamay now. And there were also political reasons and economic reasons for him to rail against the
yeah,
variety.
absolutely. It's always, I suppose, more complex than maybe.
Yeah, the other thing is that Gamay is a very fertile variety. And if you plant Gamay on the generous soils of Burgundy, it tends to deliver very high yields. And if you've got lots and lots of bunches on a vine, you might struggle to ripen
Mm.
those bunches efficiently, which means that Gamay in the north maybe doesn't deliver quite as well as it does on the poorer granitic soils and volcanic soils that dominate in Beaujolais itself. So it's also possible that if it was Gamay that Philippe Lardy took against, that it simply wasn't performing terribly well in Burgundy.
I remember being struck when I visited the region, just these low-lying bush vines, very different to the trellised vines that you see here in Verona.
Yes. So actually, I always feel that when you've transitioned from the Maconnais into Beaujolais, because the two regions are literally next door to each other. In fact, I know producers at the northern end of Beaujolais who also have vineyards in the Maconnais, and their vineyards in Maconnais face their Beaujolais vineyards literally across narrow laneways, paths. And when you've moved from the Chardonnay vineyards of the Maconnais to the Gamay vineyards of Saint-Amour in Beaujolais, because you transition from trellised vineyards to these low-lying bush vines that dominate in the crus. And then once you get into southern Beaujolais, into the Beaujolais appellation zone, typically you're back with trellised vineyards again.
For me, it was a realization that there's no substitute for being on the ground if you want to study and learn about wine. Books, of course, are fantastic, but it's so much more memorable way of learning if you're actually fortunate enough to be able to visit the region.
Yes, and one of the things that I really hope that at least some people get out of this book is that they'll read the book and kind of go, actually, you know what? I really want to go there, because it's a region that's well worth visiting for reasons that we'll talk about later.
I'm sure they will. And do you want to give us a reading at this point, Natasha?
Yeah, so this is about the Chapel of the Madonna, which is in Fleury. And Fleury is one of the most famous of the 10 crus in Beaujolais. So the Chapel of the Madonna sits atop one of the highest hills in Fleury, and the lookout point situated immediately beneath it is a splendid place from which to enjoy views across the entire region and out towards Mont Blanc. It's odd to think that no one seems really sure why the chapel was built in the first place. One legend has it that it was built in the hope that the Madonna would intercede on behalf of the local grape growers and prevent the surrounding vineyards from succumbing to fungal diseases. The other story told is that the Madonna's chapel was erected on the hillside in thanks for her having protected Fleury from being invaded by the Prussian army during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. Either way, for growers and visitors alike, the Madonna and her chapel have now become a visual shorthand for the entire region. The hill on which the chapel perches is far from the only one in Fleury. The cru is among the most precipitous in Beaujolais. Most of its slopes are extremely steep, their gradients ranging from tricky to climb to head-spinningly vertiginous. In the main, these slopes are made up of pink granite, some of which is very shallow and stony, while other locations have a much greater depth of decomposed granite sands. And while most of Fleury's vineyards are planted on these stony soils, there are two tongues of alluvial deposits extending out from the east of the appellation towards the plain of the Saône River. The granitic sands are incredibly free-draining, so much so that you can drive a tractor through the vineyards the day after heavy rains with no fear that it will get bogged down in sticky mud. This is great news if you're a grape grower in a very rainy year. Less so in hot, dry years when those sands can wick moisture away from the roots of the vines with deadly efficiency. Furthermore, it's difficult to develop humus on steep rocky slopes, so Fleury's terroir can make organic farming a challenge, especially when your vineyard is full of fragile, elderly bush vines.
Fantastic. A suggestion there just at the end of that passage about some of the challenges of winemaking in the region. We know that the region has recovered from its hangover, if you like, but there are, of course, still significant challenges, not least this lingering the reputation as a consequence of the overproduction in the 1980s. So could you tell us then, what are the challenges now facing the region? Do those old prejudices persist? And how is the region overcoming those
Well,
challenges?
it's very interesting to notice that there's almost like a two-speed Beaujolais. If you talk to people who don't work in the wine trade um, about Beaujolais, when I talked to my friends who don't work in the wine business um, about the book that I was writing, mostly what people said was, "Oh, Beaujolais Nouveau."
Mm-hmm.
That's what everybody knows about Beaujolais.
Yeah.
And yet, as we said earlier, when we were talking before we started recording, or maybe as we started recording, people in the wine trade, there is a growing awareness that there are some fantastic wines being made, that they're very drinkable, but they're also very affordable. But even so, even people within the wine trade, even though there is a growing enthusiasm for Beaujolais, there isn't really an appreciation of the diversity of wines being made in the region. As an illustration of this, I was lucky enough to be able to launch my book at a little restaurant in London a couple of weeks ago. And I invited a lot of my friends from the wine trade, and I'd also sort of rustled up a selection of Beaujolais, probably about 15 bottles for people to taste and enjoy. And I spent much of the evening with my colleagues coming up to me and going, "Do you know, I didn't realize there was so much diversity within Beaujolais." And I think there is very little understanding of just how much diversity there is in Beaujolais, especially given that you've just got the one grape variety, and Beaujolais is not a very big region as French wine regions go. But because of the complexity of the terroir in Beaujolais and the diversity of winemaking styles, which producers like to play with and ring the changes of, there is a phenomenal range of wines produced there, from very simple, easy drinking wines that you could put in the fridge and chill down and almost drink like a rosé in summer, to denser, darker, richer, heavier, more structured wines that really age phenomenally well. And in fact, the wines don't have to be quite as dense and dark to age well. We understand, for instance, if you look a little bit further north, we understand that Chardonnay or Pinot Noir in Beaujolais can have a variety of both grapes have a range of expressions across Burgundy, depending on whether you're in Chablis or the Mâconnais, or even within the Côte d'Or. But somehow, because Gamay has not been taken seriously, we don't afford it the same courtesy of acknowledging the diversity of wine styles and the aging capacity that these wines have.
That diversity, I suppose, also makes it an increasingly food friendly wine as well. What kind of things are being paired with Beaujolais wines now? Is it something that you're seeing more and more of in these bars and restaurants?
One of the things that flagged up the renewed interest in Beaujolais to me was the interest being shown by sommeliers. And let's not forget that sommeliers have been caught in a tight place where they would have, in the past, put, Bourgogne Pinot Noir or village level Burgundies on their wine lists. Typically, these wines are now on the list at, 80, 90, £100, which is a lot of money for a lot of people. So a lot of sommeliers started going out to look for alternative wines that they could put on their list that would do a similar kind of job to Pinot Noir, and Gamay fits that niche really nicely. Like Pinot Noir, it can make very bright fruited wines that have fairly modest levels of tannin and good levels of acidity. Typically, Beaujolais is unoaked,
Mm-hmm.
so oak is a character that, if it's really prominent, can interfere with food pairings. So the fact that Beaujolais is largely unoaked also
Mm.
helps with food pairing. That range of styles also helps with the diversity of pairings that Beaujolais can do. But typically, as a rule of thumb, anything that Pinot can do, Gamay can do as well. So the lighter styles, you can pair, like I said earlier, you can chill them down and drink them almost like a rosé and put them with summer salads and charcuterie. You could pair Beaujolais with some of the fish dishes that you would pair Pinot with. So things like tuna or salmon, Gamay can do the job really well as well. Uh, those tricky Asian spices that really don't go well with very tannic, very high alcohol, very oaky red
Mm-hmm.
wines. Gamay can take those on, but it's also, often a very pleasant wine with simple roast chicken. The heavier styles you can pair with red meats or even game, especially if the wines have a bit of age on them. So they're really pretty
It's
versatile.
approaching lunchtime here in Verona, and my mouth is now watering. I'm practically drooling just thinking about some of those combinations. Tell us a bit about if thinking about coming to the region or visiting the region. Tell us just a bit about the geography of Beaujolais. I understand it can be, broadly speaking, divided into the northern and southern zones. How would you characterize those two zones?
Well, so let's situate Beaujolais in
Yes, good
France
idea.
in the first place. So it lies, if you follow down through France from the north to south, Beaujolais lies, it starts literally at the southern tip of Burgundy. So you go from the Mâconnais into Beaujolais within the space of a heartbeat. Two strides will take you from one
Mm,
appellation to the other. And the southern bit of Beaujolais is less than 30 kilometers from the city of Lyon. And and in wine terms, you've got to remember that the minute you get out the south of Lyon, you're heading towards the vineyards of the Northern Road. So Condrieu and Côte-Rôtie are not far from the southern bit of Lyon. So Beaujolais lies roughly equidistant between the Côte d'Or and the
mhm,
Côte-Rôtie. So in wine terms, that positions you. For a lot of people, Beaujolais is unfortunately flyover country for people who are driving from Northern Europe to the south of France, as many people do in summer. Beaujolais should be the logical stop-off point because it's halfway
mm,
down the drive for a lot of people. But most people tend to stop either in Burgundy or else they stop in
yeah,
Lyon. Lyon has a great restaurant scene, and wine lovers tend to stop in Burgundy rather than Beaujolais, which is a
yeah.
shame. The region itself is pretty small. It's about 70 kilometers from north to south, and it's about 20 kilometers across from east to west. What makes the drive tricky, if you're not on the autoroute, is that it's quite a hilly region because Beaujolais lies, although you've got the plain of the Saône River immediately to the east of Beaujolais, which levels out the ground a bit. Further to the east, you've got the foothills of the Alps. And further to the west of Beaujolais, you've got the Massif Central. So Beaujolais itself is a series of folds and hills and valleys arising from these two mountain ranges that have kind of pushed it up. It's a bit like kind of a crumpled napkin that you toss on the table at the end of a
Yes.
meal. I referred earlier to the diversity of terroir. Part of this diversity comes from the fact that you've got a range of altitudes going from the river plain, which is pretty low and flat, right up to, over 500 meters altitude. Whereas if you think of the Côte d'Or, the Côte d'Or is stretched on a range of hills that runs north to south, but the vineyards are all planted in a south to southeast facing direction. So you've got this kind of unity of exposure in the Côte d'Or. Whereas in Beaujolais, you have vineyards that are planted south and southeast facing, but you've also got vineyards that face north or west. So you've got a lot of diversity. It's often said that the crus are hillier than the southern bit of Beaujolais, which is where the generic Beaujolais appellation lies. But actually, that can be pretty hilly too. But there is a little bit more flat ground there. So really, it's a stunningly beautiful region because everything, the road from one bit to another, even though it's not far as the crow flies, is a series of twists and turns that gives you a different view every time you move down a stretch of road.
It's a lovely, lovely region. We were staying in Lyon. We were mainly in the southern part of the region. We didn't have the chance to go too far north, but even that southern part of the region, as you mentioned, geographically speaking, it's an interesting hilly. It's not completely flat.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is you've got the built landscape as well. So in the crus in the north, where the soils are largely dominated either by this pink granite or by a bluish hard rock of volcanic origin called diorite, and the buildings in the crus are typically, depending on where you are, built either of this granite or of this bluish stone. Whereas when you get down to the south in Beaujolais, the buildings are often built using this wonderfully orange limestone that is known locally as pierre dorée, golden stone, and it really does glow in the sunshine. Right. And because the southern bit of Beaujolais is so close to Lyon, a lot of money has poured into the region. There's a lot of people from Lyon who either have weekend houses in Beaujolais or who commute from Beaujolais. So there's a lot more money in the region. So you have some quite grand houses in the south, whereas in the north, in the crus, the villages tend to be smaller. It's not that, people there are poor, but less money has poured into the region. So it's sort of maybe a little bit quieter. The houses are a little bit less grand. You don't get so many kind of gated parks in the north.
Glistening orange sandstone that you mentioned, I'm going to massacre the pronunciation here, but the village we stopped in was Oingt, is it?
Wangt. It's very, very difficult if you don't speak French to pronounce that. Yes, absolutely.
And I certainly don't. I certainly don't speak French. We had a few incidents of mispronunciation and misordering, which I'll come on to in a moment. So some of the producers that you describe in your book, they come from a fascinating and wide range of backgrounds. Some of them are local, some of them come from neighbouring regions, some from further afield, and many of them are committed to organic and biodynamic farming with a focus on quality over quantity. Could you give us a flavour of some of those producers that you met while you were researching this book?
It's been one of the reasons why now became the right time to write about Beaujolais. I talked earlier about how when I first visited the region, it was a region on its uppers. Yeah. The production had been focused largely on volume Beaujolais Nouveau, and there was a bit of a hangover after the crash. A lot of the producers that I met at the time were Beaujolais born and bred. They didn't know much about the outside wine world. They'd rarely traveled very far afield. They didn't tend to drink wines from elsewhere. In fact, many of them didn't even drink their neighbors' wines. They knew their own wines. But they certainly didn't know the wines from elsewhere in France, never mind the wines from the wider world beyond. And it was a pretty insular world in which there was a tradition of practical aid. So, if your tractor had broken down, you could go to your neighbor and borrow his tractor and he'd lend it to you willingly. But there wasn't really much of an exchange of ideas for most people. This has changed now. I've been delighted to spend time in the region and to see that, by and large, the new generation who've taken over, some of them are the sons and daughters of the producers I might have met the first time, but they have a much wider perception of what the world of wine is. This is partly because they've studied in agricultural colleges alongside the scions of families from other winemaking regions. So there's an exchange of ideas, an exchange of wines. But many of them have gone to do stage, have gone to work for the harvest season further afield, either in France, and many of them have been out to the New World, so have worked in South Africa. New Zealand seems to be a favorite, California, Oregon, Australia. They've traveled, they've seen the world, and they've come back with new ideas and a new appreciation of the wine world. Add to that, you've also got something else going on in Beaujolais, which is that a lot of the older growers never grubbed up some of their older vines, and you've got an incredible wealth of old vines in the region. And as the older producers retire, if they are not able to pass on the vineyards to their sons and daughters, quite often many of these vineyards, certainly not all of them, and there's a sad number of wonderful old vineyards that are just left abandoned. But there's a young generation of would-be winemakers who've stumbled into Beaujolais as they've been trying to find regions where they can afford to buy their own vineyards. And they found this wonderful wealth of old vine material and great terroir, and they can actually afford to buy the vineyards, which they certainly couldn't in the Northern Rhone or in Burgundy, or in other more prestigious regions. So, as well as this younger generation of native Beaujolais producers who've traveled further afield, you've also got this influx of producers from elsewhere in France and elsewhere in the world who've come to the region, and they've brought new ideas and perspectives with them. Plus, you've also got, it's unfair to tar the elder generation with a brush that all of them were very inward looking. There certainly were, even in the era of Beaujolais Nouveau, there certainly were some producers who were trying to do something a little bit differently and had an eye on quality production. So all of these things have kind of reunited at the moment to create a situation where a lot of these growers are sharing ideas with each other. They've got groups where they exchange ideas about viticulture, particularly organic or regenerative viticulture is of growing interest to a number of producers in the region. Biodiversity is another focus, but these groups that grow up around discussions about viticulture also turn into a practical way of exchanging ideas about how you make wine. So I've had producers telling me that, older producers that they've met through these groups, if they run into trouble, they know that they can get in touch with somebody who's had the same problem themselves, and they can say, well, how did you deal with it when it happened to you? And they taste each other's wines, and they give each other critiques, and they taste wines from outside the regions. One of the things I did during my last research trip is I loaded my car up with some wines from outside of Beaujolais that I thought would be of interest to some of the producers I was meeting. And we had a wonderful, riotous evening where about 20 producers gathered in a colleague's dining room, and I poured them some wines blind, and we tasted our way through some wines from, Austria, Australia, the Lebanon, elsewhere in France, and they loved it. It was a revelation to them, and their enthusiasm for trying different things and seeing analogies between what they were tasting and the work that they were doing in their own vineyards and their own wineries was just delightful to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a region to keep an eye on for all those reasons you mentioned, not least that open-mindedness and sense that interesting and exciting things are happening there. But what's it like to visit? Do you have any top tips for people visiting the region?
It's a delightful region to
Mm,
visit. I took a private client on a trip to Burgundy and Beaujolais and the Northern Rhone a couple of years ago. It was a wonderful trip. But, even as an MW, I found it quite difficult to gain access to Burgundian and producers in the Northern Rhone.
mm,
Many of them don't open doors, aren't terribly keen on welcoming visitors. There are exceptions, of course, and the bigger negociants in both regions typically are happy to open doors for tastings, at least. But visits and tastings can be very difficult to organize. Whereas in Beaujolais, many producers are very, very keen to welcome visitors who are interested in tasting wines. And quite often, because of the small scale of these wineries, you may find yourself tasting alongside the winemaker.
yeah,
And if they've got time and the vineyards are nearby, they're often quite happy to sort of take you out for a walk around the vineyards. What I would say for anybody wanting to visit wineries in Beaujolais is, because of the small scale of the wineries, please don't go at harvest time,
mm,
because it's all hands to the pump. And when you do go, make sure that you book an appointment to go and visit, because just pitching up unannounced isn't typically something that the producers are very happy about. But if you do make an appointment, they're usually really, really happy to see you and to let you taste and to talk to you about the wines that they make. It's considered common courtesy, if they don't charge a fee for the tasting, and some of them don't, to buy a bottle or two to take away with you. So, hopefully you will fall in love with wines to the extent that a bottle or two will be the least that you want to take away with you.
mm,
But, do think about the fact that these people have given you a bit of time,
yes,
and some
absolutely.
insights, and treat them with a bit of respect and courtesy, which I'm sure you will all do anyway. The other thing to note is, we've discussed how beautiful, the natural beauty of Beaujolais. And if you're a keen walker or cyclist, there are some wonderful, wonderful walks and bike rides to do in the region. And whereas accommodation used to be quite thin on the ground, or at least quality accommodation used to be fairly thin on the ground, unless there was a large group of you wanting to host a wedding party or a large gathering. But that's changed, and I've got some recommendations for some wonderful places to stay at all kinds of levels in the book. And there are some great wine bars and restaurants, whether you want to find, the perfect little French bistro, or whether you want a slap-up Michelin-starred meal. There are some great places to go and eat in Beaujolais as well. So I think it is a terrific region to visit. Spend at least a couple of days there. Spend longer if you want to. There's plenty to do.
That certainly reflects my experience as well. It was a wonderful trip. The only rather unfortunate experience we had was in a little French bistro where we ordered a dish called, and I'm going to massacre the pronunciation again, but it was Salade de Museau or Musée.
Salade de museau. Yes, not a salad, folks.
It turned out to be a plate of raw pigs. So,
yes.
We required a few glasses of Beaujolais to wash that down. Not for the vegetarians in the party.
No, definitely not.
Okay, I'm very conscious of time, so I think probably this is a good place to begin to wrap the conversation up. Tell us, do you have any plans for Beaujolais Day? We spoke about this briefly before we started recording, but that's on the third Thursday of November. It's not something you particularly address in the book, but it is an important day for Beaujolais around the world.
To be perfectly honest, I will probably celebrate Beaujolais Day by opening a bottle of wine at home. I don't have any Beaujolais Nouveau. So I will be opening a bottle of something from a Beaujolais cru and raising a glass in honor of the region that has given me such pleasure during the course of my research, and toasting it.
If I can get my hands on a bottle of Beaujolais here in Verona, I'll be doing the same. It's not so easy to come across Beaujolais here in Verona, but I'll certainly try my best. Where can we follow you, Natasha? And more importantly, where can we get a copy of your book, The Wines of Beaujolais?
So The Wines of Beaujolais is available from the Académie du Vin Library website. It's also available, or should be available, from all good bookshops. It was published in the UK on the 22nd of September, and it's available worldwide from the 1st of November onwards. And local bookshops should be able to get hold of a copy as well. I am on Instagram as, and this is a very bad pun, Natasha MW. So it's LATASHMW.
Okay, great. And I have to say, the story of Beaujolais is one that I really, really love. So I'm delighted that you've written the book, and I love reading the book as well. I got a preview review copy of that, so I'm looking forward to getting the hard copy as well. It's a region that I think, as you made clear, has got so much interesting stories to tell, but also a fascinating future ahead of it as well.
Oh, I'm glad you're such an enthusiast. That's always good to hear.
Yeah, it's definitely in my top 5 wine regions of the world.
Well, now we just have to convert the rest of the world.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Thanks once again for being my guest today. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on the Italian Wine Podcast. Ciao.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. Tune in again next month when we'll get between the vines with another great wine book. Remember, our show notes, including full details of all the books we've discussed today, are available at italianwinepodcast.com or wherever you get them.